Hello, general psychology students. This is Larry Hatcher. We are now in Unit 5, and this is my lecture for Module 1, Mood Disorders. My usual explanation here at the beginning of the video. For those watching the online video of this lecture, while you're watching this lecture, you should have in front of you the document containing my blanked out lecture notes. To get them, to download this document, log into Canvas, go to Psych100, go to the module section, find the module that is headed Psych 100, Unit 5, Module 1, Mood Disorders, and within that module, locate the document that's called Psych 100, Unit 5, Module 1, Lecture on Mood Disorders. This file is saved as a Word document as well as a PDF, although it has most of the lecture notes you'll need for this module. I've blanked out some of the important terms various places. By watching the video you're watching right now, you'll be able to fill in the missing words so that you have a complete set of lecture notes for the current module. Once again, the place that we are is Unit 5, the last unit for our semester. Module 1, the first module, this one deals with mood disorders. Outline of the topics that I plan to cover for this lecture. We're in a new chapter in the Ettinger textbook. We're in Ettinger's chapter on behavioral disorders. My lecture, I plan to cover the following. Prevalence of psychological disorders. Over the course of a lifetime, what percent of people are likely to have some kind of psychological disorders? What percent are likely to have it at a given point in time? Then we'll do a deep dive on mood disorders. I'll talk about different kinds of depression people can suffer from. I'll talk about bipolar disorder, and I'll lecture in depth on suicide. We'll see that suicide is actually going to be the subject of our essay question for this last unit of the semester. Let's begin with topic 1, prevalence of psychological disorders. What percent of us are likely to experience some kind of psychological disorder over the course of a lifetime? I like to talk about the prevalence of psychological disorders by talking about one of the first large-scale studies that was designed to determine the actual prevalence of psychological disorders. For a long time, there was debate about what percent of people will suffer from a psychological disorder in the course of a lifetime. Psychiatrists and psychologists and other mental health care providers were constantly lobbying state legislators and Congress, saying we need more money to provide services to people that suffer from psychological disorders. Common response was, I don't know anybody that suffers from a psychological disorder. How much money could you need? So there was a need to do a study that was large scale, where they had a representative sample of people and could get figures that we could have some confidence in. Figures that indicated what percent of people will suffer from a psychological disorder over the course of a lifetime. That was the purpose of this study. It was funded by the NIMH, National Institutes of Mental Health. First big paper was published by Robbins and Rieger in '91. As you've heard me say before, you'll never be tested on the names of these researchers or the dates of the publications, but I thought it'd be useful to some of you if you want to look into these topics later when you're doing a research paper on something. The study was large scale. It went on for years. It began in 1984. Over the course of the investigation, they interviewed something like 20,000 people in the United States. Started with a representative sample of American adults, came to their homes, interviewed them, interviewed people living in the homes, the spouse of the individual, if there was a spouse, the parents of the individual, if the parents were living there, and so forth. They wanted to get figures we could have confidence in about what percent of people are likely to suffer from a psychological disorder. A couple of their findings. In this class, I'm not real big on percentages, but here's a couple of percentages I do want my students to be familiar with, because these issues are likely to touch the lives of a lot of us over the course of a lifetime. Question number 1 that they wanted to get an answer to: over the course of a lifetime, what percent of Americans will suffer from one or more relatively serious psychological disorder? The answer was 32%. Now, this was a jaw-dropping statistic When the first results of this investigation were leaking out in the 1980s and the early 1990s, nobody expected the numbers to be this big. What do you mean, relatively serious psychological disorder? It's got to be serious enough that it's interfering with your life. It's preventing you from living your life the way you want to. For example, a lot of us have a fear of, at least a mild fear of high places. Some people have a fear of high places that's so bad that when they get transferred in their job to a new office where they're in a skyscraper looking out of a window that's on the 21st story, they can't take it. They can't look out that window and see what it looks like from 20-some stories up. They have to quit their job. That's what we mean by psychological disorder that's serious enough it's interfering with your life. Over the course of a lifetime, this investigation indicated that about 32% of us will suffer from some kind of psychological disorder over the course of the lifetime. Whether it's that fear of high places I talked about, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders of various types, substance abuse disorders. About 1% in 3 will suffer from one or more relatively serious psychological disorder over the course of a lifetime. Now, that's over the course of a lifetime. What about right now? If we took a snapshot of adults in America right now, what percent of us probably suffer from psychological disorder? This study indicated the answer is about 15%. That's about 1 person in 6. About at any given point in time, about 15% of American adults are suffering from a relatively serious psychological disorder, one that's serious enough that it's interfering with their lives. These were jaw-dropping statistics, and subsequent studies have gotten statistics that are similar in size to these. So there's a lot more of us suffering from relatively serious psychological disorders than most people believed prior to the publication of the first set of results from this big NIMH study. First report of which was published in the late 80s and the early 90s. So, topic 1, prevalence of psychological disorders. Topic 2 is going to be a video. Next up is a video. I'm not going to show it here in this video capture that I'm making, but I've got the link in the document that you're looking at. You'll be able to go and look at the video yourself. This is a video from the Crash Course series on videos. This one is called Getting Help, Psychotherapy, Crash Course. It's about 11 minutes in length. It talks about basic issues related to psychotherapy. It talks, among other things, about the 4 major schools of psychotherapy. As you watch the video, you'll see they talk about the 4 major schools of psychotherapy include psychodynamic school, existential humanistic school, the behavioral school, and the cognitive school. A lot of information presented in a short 11 minutes. As is usually the case, you can expect 1 or 2 questions on our upcoming test to be based on the video. If you can answer the questions that I pose here, you'll be able to handle my questions on the test just fine. Question number 1. Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy belongs to which of the 4 schools of therapy? Of these 4 schools, psychodynamic, existential, humanistic, behavioral, and cognitive, Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy belongs to which? If time permits in this unit, I plan to lecture on Carl Rogers' client-centered therapy. If not, your one exposure to it will be in this video, so keep that question in mind as you watch it. Question number 2. Of the 4 major schools of therapy, which one is characterized by all of the following? Which school of psychotherapy teaches people new and more adaptive ways of thinking? We're talking about just one school of psychotherapy here, which is the school that teaches people new, more adaptive ways of thinking. It challenges catastrophic thinking. It helps people to think more positively about themselves and about their future. Of the 4 schools of psychotherapy I alluded to before, which one school has all of these characteristics? Watch the video, look for the answers to those 2 questions. If you have the document, the lecture notes, the blanked out lecture notes in front of you, the link should appear in that document. You can control click this link, go right to the video, watch it, and you'll have the answers to the questions. I've tried to segue to a place in these lecture modules where I don't give you the answers to the videos anymore, to further encourage you to actually watch the videos. I think you'll find them entertaining. I think you'll get a ton of information out of them. If you watch the videos and you still aren't sure what the answers to the questions are, you can ask me about it during the review session that we'll have shortly before Test 5. But for the time being, I'll leave it to you to fill in the blanks and get the answers to question 1 and question 2 pertaining to this video. Instead, I will move on to our next topic. The second topic I'm lecturing on, and the first topic that I'm going to lecture on in great detail, is this: mood disorders, the family of mood disorders. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association talks about the various psychological disorders people can suffer from. Think of these disorders as being divided into families of disorders. One of the big families is the family of mood disorders. We can define the family in this way. Mood disorders are disturbances in mood or prolonged emotional state. The classic example of a mood disorder is depression, where people suffer from extreme sadness and hopelessness. In fact, that's going to be the first mood disorder that I talk about in some detail. But remember, we're beginning with the family. The bigger family is the family of mood disorders. Probably the best single example of a mood disorder would be depression. Let's go ahead and start defining our terms when it comes to depression. What are the characteristics of depression? It is characterized by overwhelming feelings of sadness. Now, that's not going to surprise you. You knew that before you enrolled in this class, but there's some other characteristics we associate with depression that may not be obvious. People suffering from depression typically will display a lack of interest in normal activities. An individual prior to going into the depression was very interested in bowling and was a member of a bowling league and never missed any practices or any games. Recently, he seems to be not himself, seems sad, doesn't have much to say, stopped showing up for practice, stopped showing up for games. That's the kind of thing that we would expect to see in somebody suffering from depression. More characteristics of depression: sometimes excessive guilt, sometimes feelings of excessive worthlessness. So it's not just sadness, but these additional characteristics, some of which we don't necessarily associate with depression. I mentioned, I alluded to this document before, diagnostic, the DSM. When you read it, and you'll see many references to the DSM. DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. It is the Bible of psychological disorders. It lists all of the psychological disorders that are recognized by the big professional organization, American Psychiatric Association. If you see a therapist for psychotherapy for some psychological disorder, they'll have to enter a code to get reimbursed by your medical insurance company, and that code will be tied in some way to the DSM. Major symptoms of depression according to the DSM. I'm going to go over these kind of quick and I mention them just to point out that there's more to depression than just sadness. As I go over these symptoms, you'll see some of them I've already mentioned, but some of them are going to be new and different, maybe not what you associate with depression. For example, when depressed, some people show poor appetite, significant weight loss. Other people show increased appetite, significant weight gain. I had a friend many years ago who had a sister who passed away unexpectedly. Subsequently, she put on something like 60 pounds. It was obviously just one symptom of the depression that she was struggling with. People with depression will sometimes display insomnia or hypersomnia. You know what insomnia is? That's difficulty in sleeping. Some people show that, and some people show the opposite, hypersomnia. They'll sleep 9 hours a night, 11 hours a night, 13 hours a night. Among the symptoms of depression, psychomotor agitation, psychomotor retardation. Psychomotor agitation is just a fancy way of saying they're restless, they're fidgety, they have energy they don't know what to do with. Psychomotor retardation is the opposite. They are lethargic, they don't get around much, they don't want to do much. This one I've mentioned before, loss of interest or pleasure in usual activities, decreased sex drive, that's characteristic of depression, loss of energy, fatigue. If you are a physician and you're seeing a patient who complains of loss of energy and fatigue, and you see no obvious signs of physical problems with this individual, and if you're clever, you'll pursue the possibility maybe this person is depressed, because sometimes depression results in loss of energy and chronic fatigue. Mentioned this before, feelings of worthlessness, self-reproach, excessive, inappropriate fear. I didn't mention this before. Complaints or evidence of a diminished ability to think or concentrate. And finally, characteristic number 8, recurrent thoughts of death. Suicidal ideation. That's fancy. A word just means you've been thinking about committing suicide. Wishes to be dead. Suicide attempts. That's one of the reasons I spend a fair amount of time talking about depression in this class. There's relatively few psychological disorders that could kill you. Depression is one of those psychological disorders that could kill you. Small percentage of people that suffer from depression will think about suicide. A small percentage of those will actually attempt and even succeed at suicide. That's one of the reasons we have to take depression seriously. It's one of the reasons I'm going to lecture on it in some depth in this class. We dig deeper on my outline. If you looked at the outline that I showed at the beginning of this lecture, I indicated I was going to talk about the different sorts of depression that you can suffer from. And yes, there are different kinds of depression. I'm not going to go over an exhaustive list, but I'm going to talk about the two most common types of depression. Two forms of depression. Number one, dysthymia. In the past, it was always called dysthymia. It's still okay to refer to it that way. Current DSM says it's also okay to refer to it as persistent depressive disorder. For my money, the second label is a better label for it because it's more descriptive of what this disorder is all about. Let's look at the symptoms of dysthymia, persistent depressive disorder. Less intense sadness and related symptoms. That is, compared to the second kind of depression that I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes, if you have dysthymia, it'll be less intense sadness, less intense hopelessness, and so forth. One of the defining characteristics of dysthymia is it has to persist for 2 years or more. Think of dysthymia as being a chronic condition. You might have a friend who seems to be blue much of the time, and your friend has been blue for about as long as you have known him. This might be an individual that suffers from dysthymia. Dysthymia is possibly due to biological problems. Very often when psychological disorder goes on for a long period of time, that is one of the hallmarks of something that might have a biological foundation, something with a genetic relationship. That's one of the things that researchers, that's one of the hypotheses that researchers entertain when it comes to dysthymia. A lot of researchers believe there's a strong biological component to it. So you have a friend that is blue much of the time and he's had this low-grade depression for years. Maybe that individual suffers from dysthymia. That's one form of depression. There's a second form of depression that I'm going to lecture on, and that is major depressive disorder. Earlier when I was talking about dysthymia, I said less intense sadness compared to what? Compared to this, compared to major depressive disorder. Characteristics of major depressive disorder. intense sadness and other symptoms. When somebody suffers from major depression, very often they are so sad, so hopeless, they don't have the energy to go to work in the morning. They may not have the energy to get out of bed. These folks may spend days in bed, even weeks in bed. So, intense sadness, intense other symptoms. Major depressive disorder typically lasts for several months. Now notice the difference between it versus dysthymia. Dysthymia, 2 years or more. Major depressive disorder, several months. Major depressive disorder is usually self-limiting. You usually will get better from major depressive disorder even if you don't seek therapy. That doesn't mean you shouldn't seek therapy, because as we mentioned before, one of the possibilities with depression is you may start thinking about killing yourself. You should seek out therapy, but most folks, even if they don't seek therapy, they will usually get better after a period of weeks or a period of months. It's usually self-limiting in that way. One of the other things that distinguishes major depressive disorder from dysthymia is this. Major depressive disorder is very often caused by a difficult life event. You had a child that you loved dearly, and the child got sick and died, and you went into major depressive disorder. You had a job that you loved dearly, and you were laid off from the job. You go into major depressive disorder. So think of dysthymia as chronic and low grade. Think of major depressive disorder as being very intense, but usually relatively short term. That's an introduction to two common forms of depression. With most of the psychological disorders that I lecture on, I want to say a few things about psychotherapy. Now, Ettinger in the textbook divides psychological disorders and psychotherapy into two different chapters. I like to kind of smash them together. I like to talk about a psychological disorder and then talk about one or two forms of therapy that have been proven to be fairly effective in treating this kind of psychological disorder. We're talking about mood disorders. We're talking about depression. What kind of psychotherapy tends to be particularly effective in treating depression? Well, sort of at the top of the list is this: cognitive therapies. Now, before I talk about cognitive therapies in any detail, let me back up a little bit. Much research has been conducted on the effectiveness of psychotherapies. Thousands of empirical investigations have been conducted, been going on for decades. Today in statistics, we have this procedure called meta-analysis that allows us to look at dozens or hundreds or even thousands of investigations and get the big picture. What does the bulk of the evidence say regarding this thing that we're studying? Many meta-analyses have been published on the effectiveness of psychotherapy, and these meta-analyses indicate that the forms of psychotherapy that are widely used today, all of them are effective. We're going to see behavioral therapy is effective. Psychodynamic therapy is effective. Humanistic therapy is effective. Cognitive therapy is effective. These meta-analyses often indicate that some types of psychotherapy may be slightly more effective in treating certain specific psychological disorders. The differences are typically not major. It's not like this kind of therapy is totally effective for depression, but that kind of therapy is totally ineffective. The differences tend not to be big, but anytime there is a difference, I want to talk about it when I'm lecturing on that psychological disorder. In talking about depression, whether it's dysthymia or major depressive disorder, meta-analyses indicate that a form of psychotherapy that tends to be particularly effective in treating depression are the cognitive therapies. And yes, this is a family of therapies. There's more than one. One example of cognitive therapy is rational motive therapy. Another is Beck's cognitive therapy. When you read about cognitive therapies in Ettinger, you're going to see that they're all about thinking Remember, the word cognition basically means the same thing as thinking. If you're undergoing cognitive therapy, the therapist is going to help you think differently, to think differently about yourself and to think differently about the world, to have a more positive opinion about yourself and your ability to deal with life, to have different opinion about the world, and come to see the world as being a more positive, less threatening thing than you otherwise would have. It makes a lot of sense that the cognitive therapies would be effective in treating depression because, to some extent, depression is a problem of thinking. You have come to think in very dark terms about yourself and about the world. If we can change the way that you think about yourself and the world, then your depression is likely to lift. That's among the reasons that these cognitive therapies apparently are particularly effective in treating depression and other mood disorders. Now, cognitive therapies are not the only kind of therapy that's used to treat depression, probably not even the most commonly used therapy for treating depression. If you suffer from depression and you wisely seek out help, maybe starting with your family doctor, family doctor is not going to give you cognitive therapy. Your family doctor hopefully is going to refer you to somebody that can give you some kind of talking therapy like cognitive therapy. But in the meantime, there's a good chance your family doctor is going to use an additional approach in treating the depression. Your family doctor is probably going to prescribe antidepressant drugs. Antidepressant drugs are big. They, to some extent, are controversial. For what it's worth, I have a generally positive opinion of antidepressant medications. I think that when somebody's suffering from depression, it's usually a great idea to go on prescription for antidepressant medications while you're setting up an appointment to get some kind of talking psychotherapy. I agree with the critics who worry that there's probably too much prescribing of antidepressant medication. Probably too much of the public is on antidepressant medications. But with those criticisms in mind, for the most part, I think the availability of antidepressant drugs is a good thing. I want to introduce antidepressant medications. We're going to bump into them a couple of times in this unit because they're used to treat more than one kind of psychological disorder. I want to say a little bit about the history of antidepressant medications to kind of set up what's going on today. Antidepressant medications have been around for decades. Up until the late 1980s, there was only two kinds of antidepressant medications that were in the tool chest for treating people that suffered from depression. There was one family of antidepressant medications called the MAO inhibitors, another called the tricyclics. I believe you've got an item on your study guide that asks how do antidepressant medications work in general. These older antidepressant medications, which are effective and are still in use today, mostly worked by increasing levels of serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain. Early in this course, I indicated that we're going to talk about neurotransmitters at various points in the semester. This is one of the points in the semester where it's relevant. These older antidepressant medications typically work by increasing levels of serotonin and norepinephrine in certain parts of the brain. They were not perfect. Both the MAO inhibitors and the tricyclics had side effects. The MAO inhibitors, if you're on them, you have to be careful about what other medications you take because they can show serious interactions with other kinds of medications. Tricyclics would have side effects that some people did not like. In some people, it might make them sleepy. In some people, it might make them gain a little bit of weight. None of this was anything people could not live with, but pharmaceutical companies realized that people had complaints about antidepressant medications. They were always seeking new forms of antidepressant medications that would be effective and not have those side effects. In the late 1980s, they hit pay dirt with the release of Prozac. In 1988, Prozac became available. It's an important milestone in the development of medications for treating depression and other psychological disorders. Prozac is a member of a family of antidepressant medications called the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Nobody wants to say that term many times in a row, so it's usually abbreviated as SSRI. Suffer from depression, your family doctor says, I'm going to put you on an SSRI. What he or she is saying is, I'm going to put you on Prozac or one of the cousins of Prozac. Prozac was just the first. Today, there are large number of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are available out there. Zoloft is an example. Luvox is an example. So there's a bunch of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Prozac and its cousins are now among the best-selling of all prescription medications. They became popular because they tend to have fewer side effects compared to the older medications. Most people can take Prozac. They're less likely to have problems with weight gain and daytime sleepiness and such. Prozac and its cousins are controversial, in part for the same reason that the older antidepressant medications were controversial, and in part for new reasons. Some people say their personalities are somewhat different when they're on Prozac and similar medications. That's kind of a sub-controversy related to these SSRIs, and the SSRIs are not the only new family of antidepressant medications that are out there. So, when it comes to treating depression, you have a number of choices. When it comes to talking type psychotherapies, cognitive therapies are particularly well regarded. A lot of people that suffer from depression and other mood disorders will find themselves on Prozac or some other antidepressant medication. We are still talking about mood disorders. When you think mood disorders, first thing that should come to mind is depression. But depression is not the only mood disorder. As I said, it's a family of disorders. Another member of this family is something called bipolar disorder. Something that years ago was called manic depressive disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder. It involves swings between depression and mania. You'll spend some period of time displaying depression. You'll spend some period of time displaying depression. You'll spend some period of time displaying mania. Now, before I talk about what mania is, these swings between these two mood states vary from person to person and from time to time. You might spend several weeks depressed, and then several weeks relatively normal, and then several weeks in a manic phase. Or you might go through these mood state changes in the course of a day. In the morning, you might be depressed and sad and hopeless. For a few hours in the afternoon, you feel okay. And come evening, you're displaying mania. It varies from person to person and from occasion to occasion. Now, what do you mean by these two mood states? Depression, I've already lectured on. You know what depression is all about. Mania is something new. Think of mania as being sort of the opposite of depression. When somebody's in the manic phase, they're typically overexcited and hyperactive. They're typically very talkative. I saw a documentary on bipolar disorder, and they interviewed some people while they're in the manic phase, and their most striking characteristic was the fact that they were so chatty. They had so much to say. It was just rapid yak, 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 and that's fairly characteristic. Doesn't always come out that way. Some people, when they're in the manic phase, are exceedingly happy, and that's kind of the stereotype of what we associate with somebody being in the manic phase. Sometimes they'll do grossly inappropriate things. When I was an undergraduate, I took abnormal psych class from a therapist who said that he had a client that suffered from bipolar disorder. At one point, his client went into a manic phase. Now, this client was a good man. He was a middle-aged man. He was married. He was a good husband. He had some young children. He was a good father. But he goes into this manic phase, and it causes him to do something grossly inappropriate. He meets some young woman. She was like 19 or 20, a lot younger than him. He decides he's in love with her. She decides she's in love with him. They run off to Vegas and get married. Now, she has no idea that he's a married man. She has no idea what a grossly inappropriate thing this is. He's in love. He can't stop himself. But as is always the case, he eventually comes out of the manic phase. He realizes the horribleness of what he's done. He slides into the stage of being depressed. So you can see where it's kind of logical that they would alternate between the manic phases, sometimes causes them to do something inappropriate, leading to the depressed stage where they feel bad about this bad thing that they have done. Those are the primary characteristics of bipolar disorder. A lot of researchers believe that bipolar disorder has a strong biological component. You look at images of people's brains and it appears different. Their brain image, if you do an fMRI, the image looks different when they're in the manic phase versus the depressed stage. That's something that tells you there's a biological component to it. We know that there's a genetic component to it. It tends to run in families. Investigations done with identical twins show that if one twin has bipolar disorder, the other is much more likely to have it as well. There's different ways of treating bipolar disorder. There are psychological approaches, there are talking approaches. The first line of defense against bipolar disorder is going to be use of medication. For ages, psychiatrists and physicians have treated bipolar disorder with lithium salts. Lithium is still used to treat bipolar disorder today. Pharmaceutical companies have come up with additional medications that can be used to treat bipolar disorder, but for many decades that was the first line of defense. It's an interesting medication. You would think that with something like bipolar disorder you'd need two medications. You would think you need an antidepressant medication to address the depression. You would think you'd need some kind of tranquilizer to deal with the mania. But if somebody has bipolar disorder and you catch them just at the right point in their cycle between depression and mania, then one medication, lithium, is typically effective in leveling off those mood swings. They don't get depressed as often, and when they do, they don't get as depressed. They don't go to the manic phase as often, and when they do, it's not as extreme as it was before. All achieved with just one medication, lithium. Next up is a video that you are going to watch on your own. I'll introduce the video, say a few things about it, and I'll give you some questions that I want you to have in mind as you watch it. You're going to see a short little 5-minute video called What is Depression? I believe this is one of the videos that's produced by the TED Ed people. The TED Talk people have put together all kinds of instructional materials and instructional videos to help teachers like me teaching courses. They have a video called What is Depression? I like to show it because it provides a lot of general information about depression. What are the symptoms of depression? What areas of the brain are affected? What are standard treatments for depression? Some of it is redundant with what I've already said. Some of it's going to be new material. As you watch it, 2 questions I want you to have in mind. Look for the answer to these questions while viewing the video. Question number 1. What 2 areas of the brain get smaller when a person suffers from depression? Years ago, we thought that these were purely psychological disorders that just involved emotions and behaviors. Today, we know that the brain is involved. It only kind of makes logical sense the brain is involved, but today, with imaging technology like CAT scans, MRI, and fMRI, we can see that some structures in the brain actually change in volume when somebody is in a bad depression. Okay, what are the 2 areas of the brain that get smaller when somebody suffers from depression? That will be answered in our video. Question number 2. Does asking someone whether they're having suicidal thoughts typically increase or decrease their risk of actually committing suicide? We have kind of this folklore that says If somebody is suffering from depression, the last thing you want to do is ask them whether they're thinking about suicide, because that might give them the idea of committing suicide. So very often, if you have a friend, acquaintance, a loved one suffering from depression, suicide is the last thing you want to bring up. Well, what does research say about this? According to research, is it true that asking someone whether they're having suicidal thoughts, does doing that typically increase or decrease the risk of committing suicide? Have these two questions in mind as you watch the video. If you've got the document in front of you, my blanked out lecture notes in front of you, you can control click this link. It'll take you straight to the video. It is not a long video, something like 5 minutes in length. As you watch it, look for the answers to my questions. Notice I've got my answers blanked out here. Most of you will get those answers easily. If you've watched the video and you're still not 100% sure about one or the other of these questions, you can ask me about it during our review session, which we'll have shortly before Test 5. We come to my last lecture topic for this module, and this is going to be a moderately lengthy lecture topic because it, among other things, is going to set up your essay question for test number 5. If we were meeting face-to-face, normally I would do the lecture that you're about to hear, and then we'd have a small group discussion exercise where people would work with the information that I lectured on. This discussion exercise you'll be left to do on your own, and be aware that the discussion exercise that's coming up will be the source of our essay question on the next test. Now, suicide. Here's the outline. What I plan to talk about is suicide rate. How many people commit suicide per year? Has it historically varied depending on things that are going on in popular culture? What are sex differences in suicide? What are the demographic characteristics of people that commit suicide? What are their social and personality traits? That is, if we were to put together a snapshot of the kind of person that's likely to commit suicide, what characteristics would that individual display? What are the warning signs of suicide? And here I have a note that my exercise on suicide appears below. I'm going to go over it here in a minute. It's on page D11 in your Psych 100 course pack. I want you to have these discussion questions in mind as I go through my lecture on suicide, and remember that your 5-point essay question on the upcoming test will be very similar to this small group discussion exercise. In your course pack, if you wanted to, you could pull out this discussion exercise. You don't necessarily need to pull it out because I have retyped it and inserted it here. What you're about to see is exactly what you'd see on page D11 in the course pack, my exercise on suicide. These are the questions that I want you to have in mind as I go through the lecture material that I'm about to go through. Number 1, list some steps that this university could take to decrease the suicide rate among its students. That is, give me some things that could be done by the administration, or maybe by faculty, or maybe by the students. What do you mean by that? Well, come up with things that could be useful for identification of at-risk students. Based on the research evidence that I'm about to present, what might we do to better identify the kind of people that are more at risk for committing suicide? Come up with ideas for intervention and therapy based on what I'm about to lecture on. What ideas does it give you for how we could intervene with somebody that's thinking about suicide? Based on what I'm about to lecture on, what might we do in terms of prevention to change the environmental things that promote suicide, that make people think about suicide. There is one condition, you probably see this coming having seen my essay questions in previous modules. Any recommendation you make must be based on research findings that I presented in class when I lectured on suicide. You can make more than one recommendation if you like. So this is where your points will be. I do want you to come up with ideas of what can be done to decrease the suicide rate, but your points will be located here with item 2. Clearly describe 2 research findings that led to your recommendations. These must be research findings that I presented in class when I lectured on suicide. You need a total of just 2 research findings, regardless of how many recommendations you made. What is a research finding? Anything that I'm about to lecture on, you can use it as a research finding. Doesn't necessarily have to be one of the statistics I'm about to present, just any of the concepts that I'm about to present. You can use that as your research finding. So have these questions in mind as you listen to my lecture on suicide. If we go back and look at the outline, again, the topics are suicide rate, sex differences in suicide, characteristics of people that commit suicide, and what are the warning signs. Let's begin with the suicide rate. There's different ways you could measure suicide rate. Most researchers define the suicide rate this way. They think of suicide rate as being the raw number of suicides that take place per 100,000 people per year. In the United States, in recent years, suicide rate has been about 11 suicides per 100,000 people per year. But it has varied historically. There are certain kinds of historic events that seem to contribute to a higher suicide rate. For example, I'm going to show you a graph that I got from Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now. Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now is a terrific book for anybody to read, just for entertainment and to make yourself a better educated person. Kind of the theme of the book is that most things have gotten better in the world over the past 200 or 300 years. For example, the suicide rate is not going up and up as some in the media would have you believe. This is a graph that portrays the suicide rate over the last 100 years or so. On the y-axis, we have number of suicides per 100,000 people per year. You can see, if you kind of average this graph, that in the United States, it's in the ballpark of about 11 suicides per 100,000 people per year. The most recent year for which he has figures was 2015. That's the data point that we see right here. Notice suicide rate today is not the highest suicide rate it has been in recent memory. If we look at our graph, the last big bump in suicide rate was during the Great Depression. Here's 1920, here's 1940. During the Great Depression, yes, suicide rate spiked and then came down. Ironically, suicide rate remained relatively low during the course of World War II. So historically, it has varied. In recent years, it's been in the ballpark of about 11 suicides per 100,000 people per year. Is suicide an important cause of death? Well, it depends on how you define cause of death. I'm going to go over some statistics that are provided by the CDC. Relative importance of suicide as a cause of death. Following table provides 10 most common causes of death for U.S. adults age 18 to 65 in 2007. This business 18 to 65 is important because here we're not looking at children and we're not looking at the elderly. We're looking at what we think of as being adults in the prime of life. If you're in the prime of life, what is likely to kill you? The numbers that I'm about to go over are going to indicate, there's going to be raw numbers in this table. They'll indicate the raw number of deaths due to a given cause. This table that we're about to look at shows that suicide is the 4th leading cause of death, given the way that these CDC people organize causes of death. The table begins here, and it's a listing that goes down like so, and then it begins again up here and goes down. Single most common cause of death for U.S. adults ages 18 to 65. Single most common cause of death is malignant neoplasms, which is a fancy way of saying cancer. In 2007, there was like 184,000 people that died of that. Next leading cause of death, heart disease. Next leading cause of death, unintentional injury. This is what most of us would call accidents, and probably the biggest ingredient in this would be automobile collisions. And then we come to suicide. It ranks number 4. In 2007, there's something like 28,000 people that committed suicide. Next leading cause of death, diabetes. Next up, cause of death number 6, cerebrovascular causes of death. That's a fancy way of saying strokes. Number 7, chronic lower respiratory disease. This, for the most part, refers to people that died of pneumonia. Something went wrong with the lungs filled with fluid, and they died. Next is liver disease. Next is homicide. Notice how much lower homicide ranks compared to suicide. In 2007, there was something like 15,000 homicides, but nearly double that number of people committed suicide. When we think of cause of death, we think of murder mysteries that are in primetime TV. But in fact, if you get killed in some violent way, it's not likely somebody else that killed you. Most likely, it was you that killed you. So, homicide ranked 9, HIV ranked 10. The way these rankings come out depend on how fine-grained and use of categories you're going to use. But given the 10 categories used by the CDC here, suicide ranked number 4. And in my book, that makes it a relatively important cause of death. In recent decades, we hear a lot about the rising incidence of suicide among adolescents and young adults, and this is an issue, but it can be kind of a misleading issue. To watch the media, you might think that most people that kill themselves are adolescents and young adults. Turns out that's not the case. They're not the demographic group that has the biggest suicide rate. They get a lot of attention because 60, 70 years ago, suicide was relatively rare among adolescents in particular, and it's much higher now than it was 60 or 70 years ago. But despite that, there's still not a terribly big group among those folks that commit suicide. In a minute, we'll see who is the big group. Among college students, it is a problem. Among college students, suicide is the second leading cause of death. First leading cause of death is accidents. Think of that as probably automobile collisions for the most part. That's one of the reasons I'm lecturing on depression and suicide here, because the students in my classes are at risk for suicide. Now, on the outline that we looked at earlier, I said one of the subtopics was going to be sex differences in suicide. If on the test I ask you a question about who's most likely to commit suicide, men or women, you've got to look very closely at the way I ask the question. If I ask it one way, the answer is going to be men. If I ask it a different way, the answer is going to be women. What do you mean by that? Okay, let's turn to sex differences in suicide. Researchers tell us that women are about 3 times more likely to attempt suicide compared to men. If you focus only on who's most likely to try suicide, who's most likely to attempt suicide, the answer to that would be women. Researchers tell us that women are about 3 times more likely to attempt suicide. But what if I ask the question a different way? Who's most likely to successfully commit suicide? The answer is going to be a different answer. Researchers tell us men are about 4 times more likely to succeed at committing suicide compared to women. Now, this is a contradiction. How could it be women are 3 times more likely to attempt, but men are 4 times more likely to succeed? The answer has to do with the means that are used to commit suicide by the sexes. Women are more likely to do things like take an overdose of pills. Taking an overdose of pills maybe will successfully kill you, but there's a lot of things that you can take a lot of pills of and it's not going to kill you. It might damage your liver or damage you in some other important way, but won't necessarily kill you. And even if you take something that is potentially lethal, chances are good somebody will find you before you actually expire. They'll get you to the emergency room, pump your stomach, and you won't die. So the means that women use to commit suicide is one of the reasons they tend to be less successful at actually achieving suicide. In contrast, How come men are more successful at this? Men are more likely to use sure methods of suicide. Men are more likely to use firearms. Men are more likely to try to hang themselves. If you use one of these more violent methods, you're more likely to successfully kill yourself. That is the standard explanation that's offered as to why it is that women can be more likely to attempt, but men can be more likely to succeed. If you looked at the big outline of my topics on suicide, the next big topic is demographic characteristics of those that commit suicide. Demographic characteristics, whenever you think demographics, think of that part of a questionnaire where it asks you to indicate which group you're in. When it comes to race, are you in this group or are you in that group? When it comes to gender, are you in this group or that group? If you focus on demographic characteristics, which demographic characteristics are most associated with suicide? The demographic group among the different ethnic groups. Demographic group most likely to successfully commit suicide are white people, Caucasians. Of the two sexes, males more likely to commit suicide than females. Age group. We hear a lot in the media about adolescents committing suicide, and there has been a dramatic increase in that over the last 70 years or so, but adolescents don't have the highest suicide rate. It's people in the age group of 45 to 59. It's middle-aged people most likely to commit suicide. I copied a graph from the CDC website that illustrates these demographic characteristics. Following bar chart illustrates some of these demographic characteristics. I apologize for the poor resolution in this bar chart, but I'll give you a hand in making sense of it. What we're plotting, I flipped this bar chart on its side because it's easier to compare the groups if it's flipped on its side like this. The axis at the top is the rate of suicides per 100,000 people per year. That's the statistic that I began this portion of the lecture with. You can see the suicide rate at the time this bar chart was created was around 11 suicides per 100,000 people per year. This first bar represents the overall suicide rate for all groups combined. The next two bars shows us comparisons of males versus females. Top bar is for males. Notice it's about 4 times bigger than the bar for females. This is what we mean when we say males are about 4 times more likely to successfully commit suicide. The next group represents, the next set of bars represents different ethnic groups. The ethnic group that has the highest suicide rate are whites, Caucasians. Their suicide rate looks like it's somewhere in the ballpark of 14 suicides per 100,000 people per year. If you're wondering who has the second highest suicide rate, the label is AIAN. I had to look up the legend to see what that means. This second bar refers to American Indians and Alaskan Natives. That is the ethnic group that has the second highest suicide rate. And finally, the last set of bars allows us to compare different age groups. Look at the short bar here, people from birth through age 18. These are children and adolescents. They have relatively low suicide rate. Gets a lot of attention in the media, and rightly so, because it's dramatically higher now than it was 70 years ago. But nonetheless, they still have relatively low suicide rate. The age group that has the highest suicide rate are those individuals 45 to 59. Decades ago, it was the elderly, people that were over 60. These days, for whatever reason, it has shifted, and it's the solidly middle-aged people, ages 45 to 59. So, if you think in terms of questionnaire demographics, these are the groups that are most at risk for suicide. Next topic is social and personality traits of those that commit suicide. This is where it becomes more psychological as opposed to sociological. Researchers that are interested in suicide will conduct a kind of research that's called psychological autopsy. Somebody commits suicide. You look up the family and friends of this individual, and you ask, what kind of person was he or she? What was their personality like? What was going on in their lives at the time that they committed suicide? These are the kinds of social and personality traits that emerge of the individual that's most likely to take their own lives. One of the biggies, maybe the single biggest biggie, is this: lack of social supports. People that are most at risk for committing suicide are those that have relatively few social relationships with friends and relatives and so forth. The loner is the individual that's most likely to commit suicide. Somebody living in a residence hall at a university campus commits suicide. Researchers and people and staff go around and interview the people that lived on the floor. This guy that killed himself recently, what was he like? Typically, what you'll hear them say is, I'm not really sure. I didn't talk to him much. He was quiet. He kept to himself a lot. That is what you often hear. Demographers tell us that single people are more likely to commit suicide compared to married people. There's all kinds of, demographers tell us there's all kinds of benefits that come with being married. One of them is you're less likely to commit suicide. They tell us that getting divorced increases the likelihood of committing suicide, especially for men. How come after getting divorced it has a bigger effect on men being more likely to commit suicide compared to women? Typical explanation involves the fact that women very often have a fairly broad social network. Women very often have friends, and if they get divorced, it is a bad traumatic thing in their lives, but they have other friends, they have other social contacts they can fall back on. Very often, if a man gets divorced, the only social contact he really had was his wife. And in getting divorced, he's lost the one social contact he had. Apparently, that's among the reasons that getting divorced takes a bigger toll on men than it does on women, at least when it comes to the suicide rate. We're still talking about social and personality traits of those that commit suicide. Some of these I've already alluded to before, some I have not. Trait of those that commit suicide, typically described as being quiet. This is kind of relevant to the business of lacking social support. They tend to be quiet. They tend to be perfectionists. This is one of the tragic things about suicide. Very often the kind of person that commits suicide is the kind of person that society needs the most. Very often they're smart, they are conscientious, they're high achieving people, but they set high goals for themselves. And when they don't reach those goals, they feel devastated. I remember years ago when I was at another university, I was advisor to Psych-Hi, the psychology honorary. I got to know the president of Psych-Hi. She was an undergraduate student. She was a senior. She planned to go to graduate school. Anytime my students would apply to graduate school, I advise them, you've got to apply to at least 10 schools, especially if you're going to something like clinical. Most of these clinical programs will reject over 90% of the applicants, but she had her heart set on this one graduate program. She only applied to it. She was not admitted into it. She was rejected. She came to my office afterward. She was devastated. She said she was thinking about killing herself. Now, she did not kill herself, to her credit. She lived. The next year, she followed my advice. She applied to a bunch of graduate programs, and she got into at least one of them. I know she went to graduate school subsequently and got her PhD. I share that story just to point out that the kind of person that thinks about suicide, sometimes kills themselves, tend to be perfectionists, people that set high goals for themselves, high standards for themselves. Finally, our last social and personality trait of those that commit suicide, they tend to be seriously depressed. Over half are seriously depressed at the time of suicide, and that's why we're talking about suicide in this module within the context of depression. Now, one additional topic with respect to suicide, the warning signs of suicide. Some of the things you're going to hear in this bit will be redundant to things you've already heard, but a few of them will be new items that I haven't mentioned before. Warning signs of suicide. When researchers do these psychological autopsies, what were the things that hinted that this person was thinking about suicide? Things, some of which were not really noticed by friends and relatives. Some of these you've already heard. One obvious warning sign of suicide is depression. You heard me say over half the people that commit suicide are seriously depressed at the time they do so. Health problems can contribute to suicide. This is among the reasons that we see higher levels of suicide among middle-aged and older people. Very often it's when you're middle-aged that some of the chronic health problems you're going to have come to the fore and start interfering with your life. You've heard this one before: relationship problems, loss of a spouse. A person was deeply devoted to their husband or wife dies or they lose them through divorce. A couple of years later, this individual commits suicide. Here's one you've heard before: expressions of hopelessness. Friends of mine that are clinical psychologists tell me that this is one of the biggies. All of us get depressed at one point or another. Most of us don't commit suicide. We don't think about committing suicide because we're not hopeless. We know we're in a bad situation right now, but we're going to come out of this bad situation. But what if you're in a situation so bad that you believe you are never going to come out of it? You've been diagnosed with some medical condition that you know is only going to get worse, is not going to get better. That's the kind of situation where somebody starts thinking about killing themselves. They express hopelessness to the individuals around them. You've heard this one before: withdrawal from normal activities. Here's a new one: conversation about being a burden to others. You might have an elderly woman who was always self-sufficient. She raised a family. Maybe she was a single mother, raised a family on her own, took good care of her kids, but now she's disabled. Maybe she had a stroke. She's in a wheelchair. She worries that she's a burden to other people. She thinks she's going to do them a favor by killing herself. Now, she can't see this given her state of mind, but she's actually doing something devastating to them. They wouldn't mind looking after her for the rest of her days, but with her killing themselves, they will be devastated. It'll be something that they may never be able to deal with psychologically, but this is a warning sign. Talk about, I don't want to be a burden to other people. Now here's one that maybe doesn't seem obvious at first blush, although it is obvious in hindsight: giving away of possessions. I had a good friend who, this was years ago, he was living in a distant city. He was having problems in his romantic life. His girlfriend had broken up with him. He was depressed, and I remember I get long conversations with him on the phone, and he was talking about, he kind of segued into this thing of, if anything should happen to me, this is what I want done with my stuff. You, Larry, like the same music that I like, so you can have all my record albums. And so wears the same size clothes that I wear, so he can have my clothes. And it starts going down the list, and I realize, oh my gosh, he is thinking about what's going to happen to his stuff when he's not around anymore. Now, my friend, to his credit, did not commit suicide, but that's the kind of thing that is the tip-off. Giving away possessions, talking about what they want done with their stuff when they're not around anymore. This is an individual that's already planning ahead what should happen to his things when he's not around anymore. He knows that time is coming because he's thinking about killing himself. And finally, our last warning sign of suicide, maybe the most obvious warning sign, is threatening to commit suicide. There's kind of an urban myth that if somebody threatens to commit suicide, that means they're not going to do it. And that's because you'll have a friend who's depressed, talks about committing suicide, but doesn't commit suicide. And it gives us this false belief that if they threaten it, that means they're not going to do it. but that's looking at the question from only one direction. It's probably true that most people that talk about suicide don't go on to do it. But what if you looked at it from the other direction? Begin by focusing just on the people that do commit suicide and ask, of those people, what percent of them had given some kind of threat ahead of time? Researchers tell us the answer is about 80%. About 80% of the people that successfully commit suicide give some type of verbal or behavioral warning ahead of time. That is why researchers and clinicians tell us anytime somebody talks about suicide, take it seriously. At a minimum, it's a plea for help, and at worst, this may be a person who's actually making plans for committing suicide. Any threat of suicide, any warning of suicide should be taken seriously. That is my lecture on suicide. If we were meeting face to face at this point, I'd have the class break up in small groups and do the small group discussion exercise. I'll read over the question one more time to make sure that it's clear in your mind. You should assume that your essay question on our upcoming test is going to be very similar to this small group discussion exercise. List some steps university could take to decrease suicide rate among its students. Things could be done by administration, faculty, or students. Possible areas. How could we identify at-risk students? Intervention and therapy. What would we do if we've identified somebody that maybe is going to commit suicide? Prevention. What kind of conditions could we change to make it less likely somebody would even think about committing suicide? One condition, any recommendation you make must be based on research findings I presented in class when I lectured on suicide. You can make more than one recommendation if you like, and this is where your points are. Clearly describe 2 research findings that led to your recommendations. These must be findings that I presented in class when I lectured on suicide. Need a total of just 2 research findings regardless of how many recommendations you made. Anything that I just lectured on you can use as a research finding. I would encourage you to think about how you would answer this. I'm going to, among other things, in Canvas, I'm going to set up a discussion tool that students could go to and talk about this discussion question, trade off on what their ideas are for how to answer the essay question, the discussion question. It's totally optional. I'm not going to grade anybody on it, but I wanted to have that tool available in case people wanted to banter about possible answers to these questions. Here's my references for this lecture that I just went through. This is the end of the lecture notes for Module 1. Take a look at my essay question, think about how you would answer that, and keep your eyes open for additional emails from me with the next activity, the next thing that I make available to the class.